Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Limits of the 21st Century Capitalism seminar at the New Center for Research and Practice. This seminar is by Dr. Nick Cernicek. At the end of the 21st century, capitalism appeared stronger than ever before. The alternative economic systems had disappeared, inflation had become manageable, and the threat of major crises receded from the core capitalist countries. Proponents declared that we have reached the end of history, while economists assured themselves that their expertise led to a great moderation that had overcome the business cycle. The fall from grace of the new economy in the early 2000s led to minor concerns, but economists and politicians were still confident in the security and the success of global capitalism. So Nick basically is, as his work has so far been about, challenging this narrative and sort of like showing sort of like ways forward, both in terms of the limits of capital and in terms of opportunities that exist within the current system for a what him and Alex consider to be post-capitalism. So Nick, I hope this was a proper introduction. I'm going to pass on the microphone and a camera to you, and maybe you can start.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to try to, I've got PowerPoints for this, so I'm going to try to share them here. Let's see if this works. I assume everybody can see that.
Yes, it totally works.
Okay, cool. Let me see if, yeah, okay. So limits of 21st century capitalism. What is this class all about? Basically, it's an attempt to make sense of contemporary global capitalism in light of long-term trends and ongoing challenges. So I want to sort of make sense of our current moment in light of a much longer-term history, and this is what the course is going to be all about. Now, I think what's sort of interesting is that even from a sort of mainstream pro-capitalist position, what we see a lot of right now is a real questioning of exactly what is going on. There's a real sort of mystery about why global capitalism is basically stalling out and what is causing all of these problems. So this is what I want to sort of look at today and throughout the entire course. So what do we see when we look at the global economy right now? Well, if we look at the stock markets, I don't know if you can see it too well there, but you can see that Chinese stock markets have basically been dropping all year. There's been a massive downturn in Chinese stock markets. Some of them down from over 40% on their highs from 2015. If we look at America, we see a very similar thing. So the Dow Jones, in the UK as well, the FTSE 100, all of them are down from their 2015 highs as well. So it seems again like the most sort of overt signs of global capitalism today, all of these things are sort of showing some warning signs. Now, a similar thing happens when we look to the news. So these are a couple news stories from the UK recently. One is the Royal Bank of Scotland telling its investors to sell everything. And the other is George Osborne, the Chancellor of the UK economy, warning that we face a cocktail of threats and possibly the UK plummeting down. And this has only been made worse. So he made that warning in, I think it was January, and it's obviously only been made worse by Brexit and the sort of things going on within the European context as well. But so there seems to be something going on in the global economy, something tremendously wrong. So what is happening? Well, one immediate answer is China. So if we look at Chinese growth, you can see here, Chinese growth was 14% in 2007, and it's been basically downwards ever since. So it's estimated that 2016, it's going to be down to about 6.3%. Now, the rule of thumb for China was that if it hits below 7% GDP growth, there's going to be a lot of political uproar as a result of this. So there may be a lot of political conflicts emerging in China over the course of the next year or two. Now the problem is Chinese growth drives a lot of the rest of the global economy, so it's having knock-on effects in the rest of the world. To give one example of this, China requires a lot of raw materials, raw goods, in order to keep its economy growing. Now, if your country sells a lot of raw materials, that means that as Chinese growth slows down, your economy is going to slow down as well. So Chinese growth slowing down is having a lot of knock-on effects. But there's also some broader issues in play. So it's not just China. And I think we need to also look at the role of quantitative easing over the past 8 years, actually, and the attempt of central banks to normalize policy as they're trying to get away from very low interest rates and quantitative easing. And as we're going to look at in the rest of this course, there's a number of other issues. So there's also things around productivity, there's things around changing demographics, there's things around inequality, debt, and automation. And all of these things are sort of playing into the current capitalist context where we've got very slow growth and seemingly basically no recovery from 2008. So what I want to do in this course basically is to look at each of these issues in turn and sort of say how are they playing into the slow growth of contemporary capitalism, what are policymakers trying to do to resolve it, what does this mean for the future of capitalism, and what does it mean for political struggles as well. Now, typically when people do economics courses, if you've ever done macroeconomics or microeconomics at all, it's taught from a very theoretical perspective. So you're taught about perfect competition, you talked about rational agents, and you sort of take this idealized model of the economy, and then you try to apply it to the real world. What I want to do in this course is the exact opposite. So I want to sort of look at the real economy itself. I want to look at actual empirical trends and data, and then I want to try and determine what is the most plausible explanations for what is going on. So instead of starting off with a formal theory, it's going to be a lot of empirical data. And I'll try to, even if you've never taken an economics course before, I'll try to make all of this stuff very easy and accessible. But if anybody has a question at any point, just get on your mic and let me know, and we can discuss issues. Okay, so what are we going to be covering? So 4 different weeks. This week I want to do a sort of introduction, and I'm going to look at long-term trends in productivity. Now I think productivity is one of the, maybe the key sort of factor in how the global economy is working or not working. So I want to look at long-term trends in productivity and sort of see exactly what is going on here. Next week I want to look at long-term trends in demographics and debt. So the changing nature of societies in terms of who actually exists in these societies, and then also levels of debt. So I see there's a question as well about the PowerPoint. I'm happy to give out these PowerPoints, so I'll put them up on, I'll make them accessible somehow, either through Facebook or through some other means.
Actually, Nick, we can post them to the classroom, which Tony is just setting up. So okay. The classroom, the Google Classroom should be ready, and all the syllabus plus your all the stuff that other people want to add, everything can just be there, and it will be forever available for everyone. Okay, perfect. So week 2, demographics and debt. Week 3 is going to be the changing nature of inequality. So we'll talk about Thomas Piketty's work there, sort of history of inequality over the past couple hundred years. And then we'll look at monetary policy as well. So one of the interesting things about after the 2008 crisis was central banks stepping in to an unprecedented degree to try and get the global economy growing again. So we'll look at exactly what they have done, how unprecedented this is, and how actually they may be running out of ammo to get the economy growing again. And then the last week we'll look at automation, so the possibility of robots taking all of our jobs, and we'll look at investment. So investment basically being businesses putting money into their businesses to grow their businesses, to get new machinery, and whether or not investment has been trending downwards in recent decades. And what does that mean for the global economy? So these are sort of big picture things that I want to look at, and hopefully it will all be intelligible.
Okay, so I want to start off with the big event over the past decade, which is the 2007-2008 crisis. So I'll go very quickly through a sort of historical analysis of it, and then we'll move on to what its effects have been. So the most obvious sort of fact of the 2007-8 crisis was the massive run-up in house prices and then the collapse in house prices afterwards. So you can see here, this is from Robert Shiller, who's done the most work on housing prices in the US. So he has this index of house prices, and you can see how high housing prices rose during the 2000s before the crisis. And it was basically a matter of eventually people being unable to pay for their mortgages, whether it be in Florida or Arizona, a number of other places. So what happened was people stopped paying their mortgages, and all of these mortgages that banks have lent out suddenly are going unpaid, and basically the housing bubble bursts. So credit in the housing market ends up freezing up. Banks are no longer willing to lend out mortgages. But the other problem is it wasn't just subprime mortgages. It was banks and other financial institutions using these mortgages to connect them up to credit default swaps and all sorts of financial alchemy to basically try and make more and more money off of these mortgages. So what ended up happening was what was basically a very localized problem in a few states in the US ended up taking on global ramifications because it was interconnected with the entire global financial system. Now, eventually this meant that the credit market in the entire financial system ended up freezing. People were unsure of who was actually bankrupt and who wasn't bankrupt, so financial institutions were no longer willing to lend money to each other, and this means inevitably is going to spread to the real economy. So the immediate consequences of this were, well, financial institutions cut their lending, not just to other financial institutions, but also to businesses within the real economy, personal individuals. All of these sorts of groups were unable to get credit anymore. Now consumers start paying down their debts as well. So rather than consumers going out and spending more and more money to prop up the economy, now they're paying down their debts because they're fearful of what's happening. And this is another sort of aspect that weighs down on the economy. Now what governments tried to do was they tried to put more liquidity into the system. So liquidity is basically the ease of access to money. So can you get something when you need it? And governments were basically trying to provide money to companies and financial institutions which needed it in order to keep them from collapsing. So this was the immediate sort of repercussions of the 2007 and 8 crisis. Now the other aspect, though, is that as a result of the crisis, businesses also start to try and pay down their debts rather than looking to expand. So again, rather than the economy trying to grow, it's just a bunch of people trying to pay off their debts and trying to survive rather than grow the overall economy. Okay, so the end result of all of this was a very, very deep, deep recession. So a couple sort of consequences of this. It's been estimated that household net worth in the US dropped by $16 trillion, which is about 24%. Non-farm payrolls, so this is the number of jobs being worked by people not involved in the agriculture sector, that fell by 8.7 million jobs, or 6.3%. And overall, there's a massive loss of spending power, a loss of employment, and a loss of skills as a result of the crisis. Now, the optimistic case, if we have a return to trendline growth, basically says that the results of the crisis will be $6 to $14 trillion of lost output. That's if we return to the same trend line of growth that we had before the crisis, which is about 82% of US GDP, or about 10 months worth. So basically, if the US economy didn't work for 10 months, if it just stopped for 10 months, that's about how much we've lost. That's the optimistic case. Now, the pessimistic case is that we don't return to the same trend line as what we had before. In this case, there's more than $28 trillion of lost output. So this is 164% of US GDP, or about 20 months. So if the US economy were to just disappear for almost 2 years, that's effectively how much we would have lost from the 2007-8 crisis in terms of GDP. And this works out to about $240,000 per household. So this is an immense amount, an immense cost brought about by the crisis. So what does this mean for today? Well, that was the immediate fallout from the crisis. But let's sort of see where we stand now, 8 years after the crisis has begun. And I want to look at the sort of biggest indicators here. So if we look at growth, growth has been extremely sluggish. So these are World Bank figures here. If you can see, basically, the yellow line is a sort of pre-recession average. And afterwards, you can see that we've not returned to the pre-recession average since basically 2013. It's been going down every single year. We've had a slower and slower global growth. You can also see, in terms of trade, now it's a little bit of a complicated chart, but you can see the blue line there is trade growth before 2002. You can see the brown line is when China joins the World Trade Organization in 2002. There's a massive upsurge in trade growth. So China joins, and suddenly it's much easier to trade with China, and that takes off, global trade. Now what's happened after the crisis, which is the final line there, is basically global trade has been very, very sluggish. In a lot of cases, global trade has basically stopped since the crisis. So countries are no longer trading with each other for some as yet unknown reason. And this is one of the sort of mysteries of the contemporary economy, is nobody's quite sure why global trade is so sluggish. Now, if we look at industrial production, we can see here, this is percentage growth, annual percentage growth. We can see that since 2010, it has been trending downwards globally in the advanced economies and in developing economies as well. So the industrial production of the world, manufacturing, has been trending downwards since the crisis. If we look at this figure here, this is, I believe this is a UK figure here. This is, oh no, sorry, this is global industrial output. The blue line is the Great Depression. The red line is the 2008 crisis. And you can see, actually, in terms of global industrial output, we're actually worse than the Great Depression. The Great Depression was doing better than we were at this point. So we've got a very, very weak economy since the 2008 crisis. Likewise, if we look at individual economies, so in Europe, we've had a very weak recovery in the UK. Just recently, we've got growth back, but we've had very, very low wage growth in the UK. So people are barely making any more money than they made in 2008. You've got very high unemployment in Europe, upwards of 20–30% in some economies. Likewise in North America. So the US is supposedly seen as one of the leading lights of the global economy, but actually it's been a very weak recovery in the US. It's been below trendline growth. It's not been doing better than it was before the recession. And you've had strong employment in the US, so I forget the exact figures now, but unemployment in the US is about 4.5, 4.6%, I think. But this has been because of a declining labor force participation rate. Now, what the labor force participation rate measures is how many people are actively seeking jobs. And what you've seen is a huge number of people who are no longer looking for jobs in the US. They've basically given up on trying to find a job for whatever reason. So the unemployment, the sort of headline unemployment figure in the U.S. looks good, but this is because a lot of people have left the labor market. And likewise, Canada has sort of been perpetually on verge of recession. It probably is going to end up in a recession very soon. So that's North America and Europe. Likewise, if we look in the low-income economies. So Brazil is in a very significant recession. Venezuela is in a massive crisis at the moment, and it seems quite unlikely that they're going to find any easy way out of it. This is partly because of a decline in oil revenues, but there's also sort of other factors in Venezuela as well. If we look at Asia, we see China stalling, as I showed before, and you've got some sort of financial turmoil at the start of 2016, which has somewhat disappeared now, but I think it's bound to come back as you sort of get loans going unpaid and banks trying to recover their money. India's growth is also declining, and then Africa. So you've had African economies are mostly dependent upon commodity exports. So when commodity prices go down, which they have, this weighs very heavily on a lot of African economies. So it means a significant decrease in their exports and also a rising external debt costs for a lot of African economies. So basically, nowhere in the world do we see sort of an optimistic case for the global economy, for any economy really. Now what's interesting about this is we've got a very, very weak global economy despite unprecedented government interventions to try and save the economy. So the use of quantitative easing has put trillions of dollars into the global economy. You've got extremely low interest rates, which are supposed to make it very easy for businesses to get access to credit and grow their businesses. And we've got all sorts of efforts to try and get the economy growing, but it's not. It's just not going anywhere. And so this is one of the big sort of mysteries, is what is going on? According to every mainstream economist, we should have rapid economic growth at this point, but we're not seeing it. Now, I think one of the more scary sort of indicators of this problem has to do with potential output. So what is potential output? Well, it's the maximum sustainable level of output from an economy given the institutions and resources available. So you can sort of imagine if the American economy was running at its top peak form, how much would it be able to put out? So it sort of sets a limit to how much the economy can put out. That's what potential output is. Now, according to textbook economics, a recession does damage to actual output, but doesn't affect potential output. So the idea being that a recession may temporarily cause businesses to output less than they could, but it actually doesn't affect potential output. Now the problem is, this isn't what has happened. Instead, we seem to have the 2008 crisis having a massive decrease in potential output. And this means that we have long-term consequences because of the crisis. So here's one example from Lawrence Ball. So he's looked at the effects on the crisis, the effects of the crisis on potential output in 23 different OECD countries. And he finds, on a weighted average, an 8.4% decline in potential output. And you can see on this chart here how individual countries have been affected by a decline in potential output. So this ranges from virtually nothing in Australia and Switzerland to an over 30% decline in Greece, Hungary, and Ireland. And I see a question about how do you measure potential output. I can send around the equations a bit later on after the course. But the idea is sort of you take a measure of where the economy stands in terms of its productive capacity, in terms of the resources available to it, and then you do a sort of simple measure on the basis of that. There's a lot of problems with the idea of potential output in terms of a measurement, but as a nice sort of broad idea for what the economy could do is quite useful. Okay, so Lawrence Ball finds a massive loss of potential output. Now, he says 8.4% has been lost since 2008. Now, how big is 8.4%? Well, Germany takes up 8.2% of the sample. So this basically means if we were to take Germany, stop the German economy entirely, that's about how much potential output we have lost in the global economy. Or not even the global economy. This is just the OECD countries. So this is a significant impact. Even if the economies were basically to start growing rapidly, their potential is much lower. They wouldn't be able to grow as rapidly as they were able to before. So this is one of the major issues that we're trying to face up to, that economists are trying to figure out to right now. So what are some of the proposed explanations? So why is potential growth lower right now? And this is one of the main questions I want to look at over the course of the next few weeks. Is basically to see, well, why is this the case? What has happened? Well, one answer from the research is that recessions may cause damage. Now, this goes against textbook economics, but there is a lot of research that's starting to emerge which says that actually maybe recessions do cause permanent damage and not just temporary damage. And this is known in the literature as what's called hysteresis. If you ever come across that word, that's what it means. Now, there's three basic reasons given in the literature. One is workers are harmed by being unemployed. So you imagine, you're fired from your job and you struggle to find a job for the next year or two. You're going to lose skills. You're going to lose motivation. You're going to lose all sorts of aspects which maybe made you a productive worker. So there's that sort of effect. Capital accumulation is lost as well. So capital accumulation is businesses purchasing new machinery, buying new factories, building up more productive capacity. In a recession, a lot of that is lost, and it slows down the trajectory of growth. So when the recession is over with, you don't have as many factories left to grow the economy, for instance. The other sort of explanation is that, well, the processes of technological innovation may be stalled as well. So during a recession, people may be suddenly paying down debts rather than spending money on research and development. So this means that we lose 6, 7, 8 years of technological innovation as a result of recessions. And this means, again, that we lose productive capacity because of a recession. Now, perhaps all of this is normal for a crisis. This is sort of another explanation from Christina Romer and David Romer. And they say that, well, with a financial crisis, it can also have long-term effects on an economy. So they look at the effects of financial crises in advanced economies over the last 40 years, and they find that the effects on industrial output tend to last about 2 years. And the effects on GDP tend to last about 5 years. But this is largely because of Japan's experience. So Japan had a financial crisis in the early 1990s, and they've basically been stagnant ever since. So once you exclude Japan from that data set, the effects on GDP are supposed to be highly temporary. So Romer and Romer sort of see it as a mystery. They say, well, financial crises are not supposed to have long-term effects on the economy. They're not supposed to decrease the potential output from an economy. So it raises the question again of why is the global economy still sluggish? Well, one answer, largely from Joseph Stiglitz as one of the main proponents of it. So Christian, do you mean real or present GDP? For which aspect here?
Japan and the Japan thing and like right there.
Yeah. So talking about in terms of real GDP.
All right, yeah.
Okay. So a second sort of explanation for why we've had slow growth and a decrease in potential output is maybe we've got a lack of global aggregate demand. So basically, think about this in terms of who is willing to buy the goods that are being produced by the economy. If we've got low aggregate demand, that means that there's not enough businesses and consumers and governments willing to buy the goods that are being produced. So maybe this is our problem. We don't have enough people willing to buy stuff. And this could be caused by rising inequality. So think about it, if you're very, very rich, a lot of your money doesn't actually go towards purchasing goods, basically because you've already got everything you need, and a lot of your excess money goes towards financial investments or housing, things like that. If you're very, very poor, you just don't have money to be able to spend on, luxury goods and consumer goods and all sorts of stuff. So rising inequality is one explanation for why we might have a lack of global aggregate demand. Now the other aspect is government austerity. So there's basically three groups who buy goods in the global economy. You have businesses, you have consumers, and you have government. Now government austerity basically means governments are no longer purchasing things. So this is obviously going to lead to a decrease in global aggregate demand as a result. So this is Joseph Stiglitz's argument. And he says, well, the solution is quite simple then. One is reduce inequality. So we get more money to poor people, and they can be spending more money as a result. And we also need to increase government investment, get rid of austerity, have governments spending money again. So that's one possible explanation. This is sort of it's a very Keynesian explanation of the problems that are facing us. And one of the things I want to do over the course of the next couple of weeks is sort of critique this idea. I don't think it's just a lack of global aggregate demand, which is at the heart of the problem here. Okay, now one other sort of explanation. This comes from some research by Juan Antolin Diaz, and him and his group of people have taken a long-term look at US GDP growth, and they've searched for breaks. So certain points where the sort of average breaks into a new regime. And you can see here on this chart, what they basically found is that from 1960 to 1999, the US economy hovers around 3.6% growth. It can be higher than that, it can be lower than that, but it has this sort of mean average across that time period at 3.6%. What they find is that after 2000, that actually breaks much lower. So suddenly the average is now 2.25% rather than 3.6%, which is a huge, huge difference in economics. So they seem to be suggesting here that basically there's something longer term going on. You can see that actually the problem here is not the 2008 crisis. The problem seems to have started earlier than that. Now they look at the other G7 countries as well, and they smooth out the long-run GDP growth rates for all of the G7 economies. And you can see the red line there is the average that they find. And basically what do you see? From 1960 to the present day, GDP growth in all of these economies has been trending downwards. So it's hard to attribute the problems of the global economy to just the 2008 crisis, because this stuff has been going on for 50 years now, almost 60 years. So this is part of the sort of mystery, is, what is going on here? Yes. So Christian points out it's worth mentioning that the decrease can only be detected with retroactive data. Yeah, absolutely. Now, from a sort of Marxist perspective, the late 1960s, early 1970s was a massive crisis of capitalism, and the period since has been an effort to try and recuperate growth rates within advanced capitalism. So the whole sort of neoliberal project is to get growth rates growing again. Now, if this research here is right, that actually hasn't happened. Neoliberalism has been a failure on its own terms. And this is sort of the question I want to pose again is, what is going on here? Now, there's been another sort of answer by Lawrence Summers. So Lawrence Summers, very, very mainstream economist, worked for Clinton, was in Harvard. I think he works for Obama at the moment. But so Lawrence Summers has basically said, well, actually the problem that we see in the global economy today isn't just because of the 2008 crisis. And he asked the question, if we look over the past 20 years, have we seen any growth that's actually been financially sustainable? And he says, well, we had a stock market bubble of the 1990s, which led to a lot of growth but wasn't sustainable. We had the housing bubble of the 2000s, which again, not financially sustainable. We had the bubble in Europe's periphery in the 2000s, so Greece and Spain and Italy. And again, that was not financially sustainable, even if it led to a brief period of economic growth. We've had Japan's stagnation in the 1990s and the 2000s, continuing on to today. And today, we've now got quantitative easing, which is stimulating some growth, but again, is not financially sustainable. So Lawrence Summers basically asked this question, have we had any growth in the past 20 years that's financially sustainable? And he comes to the conclusion that no. We actually haven't had any proper growth for at least 20 years. And this is quite shocking because this is a mainstream economist saying we've got major problems with global capitalism right now. And he names this problem as secular stagnation. Now we'll talk about this when we talk about monetary policy, what exactly he means by secular stagnation. It turns out it has to do with the level of interest rates, but I'll sort of build up to that rather than throwing you into it right now. But the sort of interesting part here again is that this is now being taken very seriously by the top policymakers in the world, by the top mainstream economists in the world, that actually something is fundamentally wrong with global capitalism right now. So this is a sort of broad overview right now of where we stand. And what I want to do the rest of today and over the coming weeks is sort of take apart different aspects of the problem and sort of take apart different partial explanations for what might be going on and try and see how all these things link together and see whether or not we can come to some sort of sense and perspective on what is going on. That being said, are there any questions right now? I'll maybe open it up if anybody's got a mic, wants to ask something. If there's anything unclear or whatnot.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
What I want to know is how is this, well, I got a couple of things, but I'll go to this one first. How is this question of secular stagnation different from what Baran and Sweezy talked about in the 1960s? Like stagflation, etc.
Yeah. So a simple sort of explanation would be, and I'm trying to remember my Baran and Sweezy, but I mean, monopoly capitalism for them is basically holding back some of the potential of the global economy. For Summers, the real issue here has to do with, I'm trying to avoid some of the technicalities here before we get to them, but the idea is that there is a particular interest rate at which businesses will find it profitable to invest in the economy, to take out loans to invest in the economy. And it turns out that this interest rate over the past 30, 40 years has been dropping down lower and lower and lower. Now, the problem is it's reached such a low level that it's almost impossible to actually reach it with policy. So the idea is that the interest rate right now is too high for businesses to think that it's profitable to take out a loan and then invest in the economy. For Summers, it's fundamentally a sort of monetary issue. I don't know if that's entirely clear. It's sort of a very technical issue, but for Brand and Sweezy, it's much more to do with market power and the dominance within their capitalism of particular monopolies, rather than being a sort of monetary phenomenon.
It isn't right. It's not, as we said, not at all about monetary phenomenon. It's the nature, the structure of capitalism is such that it's according to Sweezy, its normal condition is one of stagnation, and there are various events, oftentimes exogenous events that save capitalism, or countervailing events that save capitalism from itself. But its normal condition is one of stagnation. And I'm wondering, in the monthly review, where's thesis, which Baran and Sweezy are sort of the founders of that thesis, is that Summers' view is really the same thing in many ways. It's just that it's Summers doesn't give any credit to Baran and Sweezy. He just comes up. He just says that this is something that he came up with.
I mean, there is actually sort of interesting heritage. So the idea of secular stagnation came from an economist in the 1930s called Alvin Hansen, who sort of originally postulated this idea. Now, Baran and Sweezy were massively influenced by Hansen, and Summers has sort of taken this idea and replicated it for today. So I do think there is a sort of heritage, a common heritage for both of them. I'd have to read what the monthly review press thinks about Summers' argument to see whether or not it's actually the same. I think partly for Summers it's a sort of it's a fundamental problem with global capitalism, but it's a sort of it's still superficial in a sense. So for Summers, it's still a matter of like, if we do the right thing, we'll be able to fix capitalism. Yeah. Whereas for Baran and Sweezy, it's something deeper than that. And secular stagnation, as sort of Summers is talking about, is much more of a sort of surface level phenomenon of this more fundamental issue.
Which is what I thought you. Hold on a second. Which is what I thought you.
Stefan, you have to unmute. I muted you when the phone started ringing.
I'm sorry. What I'm thinking, Nick. What I presume you're going to do is give us a more fundamental structural analysis of what's going on, as opposed to what Summers is doing, but an analysis that might correspond in many ways to what Baran and Sweezy discussed, decades ago.
Yeah. So I am going to critique Summers' argument. I want to sort of build up to it because it does rely on some sort of other knowledge to fully grasp what he's arguing for. And I think I don't want to deny Summers' points as well, because I do think he's pointing to some interesting phenomenon, but I do think it's a more fundamental issue. Now, part of the problem is so Baran and Sweezy, their argument is about fundamental problem of capitalism is it produces a surplus which is then unable to productively reinvest. And there's a sort of stagnant surplus that's left over. I'm not entirely convinced by that sort of argument, and it is a sort of heterodox Marxist perspective. It's not, doctrinaire Marxism from them either. But it might be good to talk about that once we've sort of covered Summers, and I think the third week. We can discuss sort of Baran and Sweezy, and we can sort of say, well, how do these alternative Marxist theories play into it? particularly in the last week when we look at investment. Investment is going to sort of give away the ending here. Investment turns upon profitability. So we're going to get into the issues of whether or not things are profitable. What does it mean for things to be profitable? What is the source of that lack of profitability? And investment being one of the fundamental determinants of the level of the economy. So that's I'm going to sort of build up to that, but I'd like to cover some of these other aspects to sort of get to that point first. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Again, not to cover this now, but I think the other sort of explanation, left explanation, is Brenner's long downturn idea, which has been picked up and refined by Aaron Bananev and people in EndNotes, where essentially it's also keyed into the fact that the surplus population is increasing. Agriculture, there's no way to go back to agriculture during crises because there is no peasantry anymore as it's been incorporated into high-tech agriculture. So you have this floating population in the rest of the world that becomes more and more part of a reserve. So what a crisis is essentially is that you have both surplus capital on one side and surplus populations on the other, and they can't find each other, and that's what the stagnation is about. He calls it a holding pattern, I think.
Yeah, so I highly recommend people check out, I think that's EndNotes number 2, the second volume.
3.
It's also 3, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, 2, 3, and 4, they keep doing it.
Yeah, they're all good. It's all available online as well. If you search for, I think, just EndNotes UK, you should be able to find it fairly easily.
I will try to find them and post them to the classroom.
Yeah, sounds good. So I buy into a lot of their analysis. I think they're spot on, particularly the sort of surplus populations thing. I was having an interesting conversation with somebody yesterday. So this issue about the peasantry. You know, one of capitalism's main things is that it's trying to get rid of the peasantry, force people off the land where they have self-subsistent economies and they can grow their own food, and force them into being proletariat, where you have to sell your labor power in order to get a wage. And it's been trying to do this for the past couple hundred years. This is permanent accumulation, ongoing. It hasn't been able to do that, though. We still have a few 100 million peasants in the world, probably 500 million peasants in the world. But what is climate change going to do? Climate change is going to basically make a lot of peasant agriculture unsustainable anymore. You're no longer going to have conducive weather to being able to grow food in your local land. So I think, you know, what capitalism has been doing to try and get rid of the peasantry, I think climate change is going to finish it off, which is terrible and also sort of like something we need to be aware of if we want to, you know, have a good analysis of the situation. Any other questions or anything so far?
I'm not as well read on the subject as you guys are, but a couple things that I picked up. I'm familiar with basic Marxian rhetoric with regards to critique of political economy. Whoa, the stagnation thesis that you guys posited. To me, what that seems like is like, and this definitely goes into investment and surplus and whatnot, is that you've got like, say that like with bubbles and whatnot, and you have an increase in like relative surplus value, you have everybody hop on that. It's like you're getting high off the bubble, but then the bubble collapses, and then everybody goes back to sort of like not a previous, but like a different, like this is where potential output would be, sort of, is like at the value production level of the generalized productive possibilities, you know. So it's like you, on one hand, you temporarily increase productive output, but in the long run, it's like it ends up. This is where I don't really know how it works, possibly, but hopefully, I just wanted to draw the connection there. You have like a temporary increase in productivity, but somehow it's like it doesn't work in the long run, or it works in the long run, but like the way that it seems like the big thing is like the rate of GDP going down, the rate of accumulation slowing down.
Yeah. So you're right about the bubbles. I mean, the issue with the bubble being that GDP may measure a lot of growth, but it's not really growth. It's actually contributing to the economy. So a stock market bubble seems like a whole ton of people are making a lot of money, but actually it's just, paper fictional assets that don't actually mean much. Likewise with the housing bubble. So massively extravagant prices for houses that doesn't actually add anything to the economy, doesn't add any productive capacity or anything. So part of the argument from Summers is that, yeah, we've had the only sort of economic growth that we've had has been these sorts of unproductive bubbles. I think he's right on that, and I think it's good to see the mainstream sort of paying attention to this sort of stuff now. But we'll have to see exactly what the sort of explanation is for it. Now, I should say I don't want to come down too hard on any one explanation in this course. What I want to do is lay out exactly a lot of the data about what's going on, and sort of say, well, how do we make sense of all of this, and try and give some explanations. But I think that nobody quite knows yet. I don't think any of the standard Marxist explanations fully appreciate what's going on, even if they get closer to the truth than Summers or Keynesian. So there's some interesting challenges here, and that's what I want to continually point up in the course. Are there any other questions?
I just had a brief and maybe, I guess, at least proximally more specific one, and it was just this question of calculation and measurement. When you have the two different values of loss
Jay, could you
for
please turn your camera down?
No, I'm on the phone. It takes up too much bandwidth, and it gets jerky if I use the camera. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if you have these two different values of total economic loss from two scenarios, the return to trend line versus no return, it makes sense to me that you'd be able to calculate the return to trend line total loss, because then you can basically delimit it in time, and you say, like, we a certain amount of lost time, and that time equals value. But if you're extrapolating a total loss over an indefinite change to a different trend line, is that like, are you calculating to an asymptotic limit? Are you extrapolating the new trend line from the 5-year trend line or 8-year trend line we've had since 2008? Like, how exactly, I don't know, what the sort of like underlying speculative assumptions about the failure to return to trend line go into that calculation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a specific answer and then a more general answer. Specific answer being that it's calculated on the basis of how growth has been going recently. So whether or not there is it making any return to that previous trend line or not, and if not, what is the new trend line appear to be given the past 8 years of growth or so. So that's sort of how it's calculated. The problem is, and we're going to come across this again and again, is that measurement in economics turns out to be a very, very difficult thing. So when we talk about productivity, which is going to be the next section, the biggest challenge is basically, well, how do you measure productivity? And it turns out economists are not really sure. They've got some broad ideas, but actually it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And a lot of the answers to the biggest questions about economics and the global economy tend to hinge upon, are we measuring something right? And it's not clear that we are. So it's going to be a sort of continual problem that, like, how do we actually measure these things? How do we know these things? How do we get data about them? And there's plenty of room for criticism there. So yeah, it's a big issue.
Cool, thanks.
So I see a question about what about Nitzan's idea that the difference between real and fictitious capital is false? I'm not a massive fan of Nietzsche and Bischler's work. It has some really interesting, provocative ideas, but um, I think they're a bit egomaniacal. I think they've revolutionized the world when they've only made some minor contributions. Um, I forget their argument about the difference between real and fictitious capital, but I think part of it has to do with they see financial capital as playing an important role in terms of hyping up investment, for instance. So let's take the 1990s stock market boom. On one level, it was a huge bubble that companies who all they had was a website and a name were worth, millions and millions and millions on paper, but had virtually, assets of virtually nothing. So that was a bubble, but at the same time, that financial bubble caused a whole bunch of investment into the internet and the infrastructure of the internet. So you had telecoms communities or telecoms companies laying down a huge amount of cables, building up, the basic infrastructure that we now rely upon for the internet, and that was because everybody thought this was the place to get, to make a lot of money. So there is a sort of role for fictitious capital and financial capital in terms of the hype cycle and how that can have an effect on what might be called real productive investment. And I think that's partly what they're talking about, but to be honest, it's been years since I've read them, so I'm not entirely sure. Any other questions?
You weren't that far off, Nick, from your characterization, but basically the argument is the more imminent idea of how there's nothing but an epistemological choice in separating the two, and this separation has become increasingly unproductive in terms of understanding how capital functions in like late 20th century. So maybe it's better to take this distinction away and reconfigure how we think what capital is, which then they go into explaining that it's power, blah blah blah, and sort of like. But this is a sister argument to sort of like undermining the power labor theory of value and replacing it with power theory of value. But I mean, we can get into this in some other time. It's just like I thought of as someone who's got a little bit of more like recent memory of the arguments. I think you were pretty right in characterizing it the way you did.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. There has been a sort of convergence between the two, between fictitious and real capital. That being said, I still think it's worth making a distinction between what we might call productive investment and unproductive investment. So let me give an example here. Right now, one of the big battles going on in the sort of tech economy, which isn't just the tech economy anymore, because the tech economy is basically everything, is over how do you get revenues from advertisements. And so you have Google and Facebook making massive efforts, massive investments into improving their advertising, getting more and more personalized advertising and better targeted advertising. On the other hand, you have a large number of people who are building up anti-ad blocker or anti-ad software, so ad blocker stuff and all of this. And basically you have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars going into what is essentially an arms race around advertising. And I think this is unproductive investment. Whereas productive investment would be, well, can we produce more food? Can we produce more houses? Things like that. So maybe the old distinction between real and fictitious capital isn't quite the right one, but I think there is still important distinctions between unproductive and useful productive investment. So yeah, maybe we can keep that some sort of distinction there.
I mean, that distinction, as we've sort of described it thus far, is basically, I mean, it's a time displacement distinction is how it's functioning. So in the case of like the dot-com bubble, you have all of these companies which are basically mimicking things that won't happen yet, will happen once there's been more development on the software business side that's running on the internet, and then that drives the infrastructural production which will make that available in the future, which fits into the whole speculative cycle as such. And then the question is just, like, how can we avoid, or why is it necessarily the case that when we get these time loop-based, like quote-unquote fictitious growth phases, why they have to end in busts, or do they have to end in busts? Which is, I mean, you can make a little bit more speculative argument about about Facebook and Google, is that, like, real investment might be in food, but that's not Facebook or Google's, like, real productive activity. Their real productive activity is gigantic amounts of data, essentially. And so you could view advertising as a basically attenuating, transient way of funding themselves while they accumulate all this data. That's their ultimate industrial output, and what they'll have to turn to for real profit.
Yeah, I just wanted to make another point too, which is that one has to be very careful in the productive-unproductive distinction, which is often used in a very loose way, as if, for example, the whole financial economy came under the unproductive factor. And what Marx says, of course, is that there isn't a fictitious economy, there's fictitious capital, as opposed to productive capital. But it's not that the whole thing is fictitious, and it has to do also with, to what extent, again, it's not just moving already created value around in the sphere of circulation endlessly, but it's having some effects in the real world, which some finance does and some doesn't. So I think as we go along, we have to be very careful how we phrase it.
I'd like to add or perhaps even subtract from that. But the general thinking is that advertising, for example, comes out of the surplus value created, and so it's that's what pays for advertising. And Marx, of course, said that industrial capitalism, would would not have been able to take off without the availability of credit and the banks. And so clearly the function of the banks were of first importance as far as the growth of capitalism is concerned. On the other side of it, there's the question of fetishism. There's the question of capital that is produced by labor in measured in labor hours by workers, and then there's the shifting around of finance capital that helps the growth of industrial capital, but in a socialist economy would not necessarily be needed at all. And it depends on the nature of the socialist economy, but the question is capital in the situation where people say that the banks have created have given the credit to industry to be able to function and grow, there's a sense in which capital is the prime mover, and in the sense in which capital is creating value of itself, from itself. And I think that's a dangerous area to go into without also thinking that there is labor is the only source, labor in nature, the only source of use values, the only source of value, and that really capital in a rational sense is not creating anything. And so we need to understand, to be alive to that, or conscious of that distinction of fetishizing capital and making it as something that can produce itself and regenerate itself and even expand itself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. One way, the role of capital, financial capital in particular, is to provide a supply of money, which would then allow businesses to actually expand their business if they need. But just providing the supply of credit doesn't mean there's a demand for credit. And one of the things we're going to come across is that, well, the demand for credit comes from businesses seeing a profitable opportunity. And if you don't have a profitable opportunity, you're not going to take a credit line. You're not going to take a loan. So the credit system is important for enabling it, but it's not the determinant of the growth of capitalism by any means. And yeah, I can sort of imagine in a socialist system, it might not be needed in the same way that it's needed today, particularly not the sort of massively speculative finance that goes on today. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, so I'll move on now to the next section here.
I want to say something. I didn't know I had my microphone unmuted. I want to draw a distinction between the whole, the power theory of value and the labor theory of value, and what you guys were just talking about too. Is like, to me, it's like, we need to talk about how to me that is like the power theory of value would be where like Marx denotes rent. Marx is clear on this, that rent is unproductive. But like I think what Stephen was saying, how to make a distinction between capital begetting itself or versus it's actually produced by labor power or whatnot is like is that like to me it's like I think that like the addition of power displaces where value is appreciated, but it doesn't alter the actual value produced. So that is where we can say that like no value was actually produced in those bubbles, or maybe not so much. And like with investment and whatnot during bubbles, it seems to me, and this is what someone was saying, is like in the long run, is like whether like there's always going to be a bust after the bubble. And to me, what that signifies is an overinvestment on behalf of investors of return, an overestimation of return. And to me, what I'm positing perhaps is that what ends up happening is you overestimate, and then you overappreciate, and you overappreciate investments, and you overappreciate debts. So you overappreciate the credit that people have, and in the so when you go through all of that, you end up inevitably with a bust. And I think perhaps because of sort of the fetishization of capital, it's quite possible, and this is definitely a hypothesis, maybe there's something inherent to the logic of investment that causes investors to overappreciate and produce bubbles, and then when after the technology has fully developed and the industry has been solidified, a lesser return is made, and then you get stagnation and less investment and whatnot subsequently after the industry has been established.
Yeah, so Philip just mentioned it as well. But the guy I just typed there, Hyman Minsky, very, very similar sort of argument. So the idea being that there is something to the investment in the credit cycle that always leads it to head towards a bubble and an inevitable crash. So Hyman Minsky, if you haven't read of him, highly recommend it. It's heterodox economics, but quite interesting, and I think quite useful for understanding financial bubbles. Now that's true and everything, but I think the limits of it are that the problems of global capitalism are not just financial. There's deeper problems here that have to do with non-financial aspects um, of the global economy. So he can be quite useful for understanding credit cycles and stuff, but we also have to understand, what's going on in terms of the profitability of real investments and things like that. And also sort of demographics, which is we'll look at next week, I think. Christian, what do you mean by it?
Well, like basically, if you don't think the problem necessarily lies in financial investment, which I would probably agree with you. Like, where do you, like you said, there's a more deeply rooted problem. Like, do you have any hypothesis like this is where we need to investigate, or this is a problem possibly?
Yeah, I mean, where I'm going to sort of end off the course is, well, investment is going to end up determining a lot of what's going on. So how much a business is spending on expanding their businesses, buying new machinery, new factories, new technologies, these sorts of things. That's investment. And that determines whether or not productivity is growing. It determines whether or not we get growth. It determines potential output. It determines the level of automation. And it turns out, well, if we go down to a business level, whether or not you invest in a new factory is dependent upon whether or not you see profitable opportunities in the economy. So this is going to ultimately depend upon why do not many businesses see profitable opportunities in the economy to invest in. And that's the real sort of issue, I think, which is a pretty standard Marxist explanation. But I think actually you can sort of get at this with utterly mainstream theories. And I think that in terms of talking outside of Marxist circles, it's quite useful to actually see, well, this is going on even in the national accounts, the mainstream national accounts. So that's partly where it's going to head. But we'll take a sort of long path to get there. Okay, any other questions now? Okay, so I'll share the screen again. Okay, wrong one. Okay, now let's look at long-term trends in productivity. So this is, I think, one of the key issues in the global economy today is productivity. It's one of the, I think, the primary aspects behind the slow growth that we've seen, not just since the 2008 crisis, but over a much longer time period. So what I want to do is look at the data and the trends over the past few decades and show that this is a long-term problem. And then I want to look at some potential explanations for why productivity growth has been declining recently. So what is productivity? Well, there's a couple different measures of productivity. The first most common measure of productivity is what's called labor productivity. So basically you take how much output the economy has, which is GDP, and then you measure, it could be, well, the number of hours that have been worked by the economy, and then you have a measure of productivity. So given how many hours have been worked, how much has been produced, or it could be by employed person. So how much output per worker. And these are two measures of productivity. So let's say, for instance, that if we had a factory of 100 workers that can make 100 cars in an hour, the labor productivity here would be 1. So real output would be 100 cars over 100 workers. Productivity is 1. Now let's imagine that we improve the technologies, and suddenly that same factory with the same number of people can now make 150 cars in an hour. So labor productivity goes up to 1.5, which is an improvement of 50%. And this is the most sort of common measure of productivity. It's quite simple, but it gets at the heart of the matter. Now we also have another complicated measure, which is called total factor productivity. It's also known as multi-factor productivity. And effectively what it is it's the combination of capital inputs and labor inputs. So you've got X amount of workers, and you've got Y amount of money that has been spent on raw materials and factories and equipment. Bringing those all together, total factor productivity measures how efficiently are those things used. So can you get more output with less input? And innovations in the production process as well. Now, total factor productivity is a very difficult thing to measure. And it's basically what's left over when we say, well, here's labor productivity, here's the productivity of labor, and the productivity of capital. Total factor productivity is what's left over. And Moses Abramovitz very famously called TFP a measure of our ignorance. So this is going to become important later on today, as we see that productivity is very difficult to measure, and we're not entirely sure what's going on here. So it's a bit of a mystery. Now, what is the importance of productivity? Well, let me give a very simple story of economic growth. Three elements involved in economic growth. One is labor inputs, another is capital inputs, and the other is this mysterious thing, total factor productivity. So labor inputs, things like the number of workers, the number of hours worked, but also the quality of workers. So are they hardworking? Are they well educated? Are they healthy? These sorts of things. But also capital inputs. So equipment, buildings, inventories, raw materials, all of these sorts of things. And then total factor productivity. Now, a simple story of growth basically says that these three things come together to produce economic growth. Now, total factor productivity is basically what allows you to increase productivity without just spending more on workers and equipment. So total factor productivity, turns out, is really crucial. And there's a great quote here from productivity journalist Michael Mandel. So he wrote this in 2008, and he says, Malthus, the sort of idea that economic growth will stagnate and people will die off, Malthus is right if there isn't multi-factor productivity growth. If you don't have new technologies, you don't have any spare resources. Whatever problem you run into first knocks you down. When the flow of technology slows down, as it did in the 1970s, people say we're doomed. And you know what? They're right. If we don't have new technologies, that magic factor, then we have global immiseration 10 or 20 years down the road. That magic factor, multi-factor productivity growth is just an extra 1%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's an enormous amount. With this extra 1%, all of your economic models get you to the same place, which is things are good. Without it, they all get you to the same place, which is things are bad. So multi-factor productivity, total factor productivity, is what enables us to make more things without having to work harder or buy more inputs. It also sets limits on what we can produce. So when we were talking about potential output earlier, this is largely determined by multi-factor productivity. We could have the same amount of people in the economy, we could have the same amount of resources in the economy, but how do we use them? What sort of technologies do we have available to us? That determines potential output, which also then sets limits to living standards. So how much can we consume? How much can we produce? That's all dependent upon multi-factor productivity. So it's incredibly important for the economy. It also tends to be tied to wage growth. Now there's been a break in this recently. So this is a chart from the New York Times, and they show that the sort of post-war economy, 1947 to 1979, pay rose with productivity. So the economy was able to produce more with the same amount of outputs, or same amount of inputs rather, and workers got recognized for that. So workers were more productive, which meant they should be paid more because they're contributing more to the economy. And that was the sort of post-war compromise. What's happened since 1979 is that this has completely broken apart. Now, productivity has continued to grow up, although as we'll see, it hasn't gone as high as we would expect. But pay has been completely separated from productivity growth. And this means that even though the economy is producing more, that extra production hasn't been going to workers. Instead, it's been going to the owners of capital. So this is, classic Marxist thesis, which the New York Times sees as a complete mystery. But if you've read, Marx, you know exactly what's going on here. So this is another reason, though, why multi-factor productivity is very important, is because it sets a limit, basically, to how high wages can go. So yes, another important aspect. Okay, so it's important, but what has been happening to it? So what are the long-term trends in productivity? Well, I want to look here at global productivity. And this is a chart from Barry Eichengreen. And basically, this is how many years total factor productivity has slumped. For how many countries, rather, total factor productivity has slumped in these years. Now, Mandel earlier in his quote mentioned the 1970s being a real period where productivity slowed down and people thought, oh crap, we're doomed. You can see the 1970s on there. Massive increase in the amount of economies who suddenly aren't having proper total factor productivity growth. Now that gets solved, but you can see that in the late in the 2000s and particularly 2007 onwards, we've had a huge spike in total factor productivity slumping again, more so actually than in the 1970s. So if one of the major problems of the 1970s was a lack of productivity growth, we actually seem to be doing worse now. And this is a real sort of threat to the global economy.
What's that measure on the left side?
On the left side, it's very small on my screen, so I'm trying to pick it up. It's density, but I forget exactly what it refers to. Basically, what it's a measure of is the number of economies who are facing a TFP slump, total factor productivity slump. So the higher it is, the more countries are facing this problem. So yeah, so the evidence suggests that we've got a global problem here. Now we can also look at other measures. So if we look at labor productivity, from 1999 to 2006, labor productivity globally was about 2.6%. 2012, it was 1.7%. 2013, 2.1%. 2014, 2.1%, which is not terrible, but it's not as good as we've had in the past. If we look at TFP, though, it's even worse. So 1996 to 2006, 1% growth per year, that magical 1% that Mandel was talking about. From 2007 to 2012, it's been 0.5%. And since 2013, we've actually had 0% TFP global growth, which is just really problematic. And nobody's quite sure exactly what's going on here, but we're going to look at some explanations. Now, one of the interesting things is that, again, this isn't just a recent problem. So if we break it down a little bit more to not just global trends, in Europe, started to slow in the late 1990s. In the US, turns out total factor productivity started to slow in 1972. So this is a long-term sort of trend going on here. You can also see some UK figures here. 1971, to more recent time. So basically, this diagram here shows GDP in blue constantly going up. Red is hours worked. So the idea here being that we haven't been working much more, but we have been able to produce more, and that's what productivity allows us to do. But when we start to look at it from 2008, we see that GDP and hours worked have increased basically simultaneously. The only reason why the UK GDP has been going up is because workers have been working more and more and more, not because we're working any more efficient. And that's what happens when you get a lack of productivity. And then this runs into problems. You run out of, workers can only work for so long. There's only so many viable workers. So all of this poses real challenges to the global economy. Okay, explanations. So what the hell's going on here? I want to look at a few different explanations. I'm not going to necessarily say any one of these is the right explanation. I think all of them have some bits and pieces which are right. I more just want to sort of throw the arguments that are going on at you, and then we can sort of maybe discuss potential explanations or potentially what is correct afterwards. Okay, so first sort of explanation, one of the most popular recently, comes from Robert Gordon, an American economist. And he just came out with his big, massive 700-page book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which, despite being 700 pages on productivity growth, surprisingly fascinating, actually. So I highly recommend it. Now, his basic argument is that new technology is not as productive as earlier technology was. And he says, well, the normal state of affairs for capitalism is actually slow productivity growth. So I think I've got a chart here. Yeah, so you can sort of see in this chart here, this is total factor productivity growth in the US. You can see at the most left-hand most side, basically what's there is virtually no TFP growth. And this is, the late 1800s, early 1900s. It starts to take off around 1910, 1920, and it grows to about the 1970s, and then it starts to taper off again. So Robert Gordon's argument is that only between the 1920s and the 1970s has the US actually seen any significant TFP growth. So the normal state of affairs for him is slow productivity growth, and we should expect slow productivity growth into the future. Now his argument, one of the main arguments here, is that there was a unique confluence of technologies in the 1920s that allowed it to take off. So things like electricity started to become not just invented, but actually started to be applied and installed in households and installed in cities, which allowed you electrical motors, electrical light, consumer appliances. So the fridge, for instance, being a major improvement in living standards. We also get the internal combustion engine at this point, which allows the automobile, allows for the highway, allows for suburban residential areas, allows for the supermarket. Technologies that arrange molecules are also invented in this time period. So petrochemicals, plastics, and pharmaceuticals. The massive increase in sort of medicinal power available at the time, which led to increased living standards as well. And then pre-World War II information and communication technology. So before World War II ever occurred, we had radio, we had television, we had newspapers, we had magazines, and these things were already building a global society and building national societies as well, and allowing us to get access to a lot of information. Now, his argument is not that we haven't had some pretty fantastic technologies since the 1970s, but they don't compare to these innovations here. The sort of massive change that you saw from these technologies was a one-off boost to the global economy that's never going to be repeated. So he has a sort of thought experiment where he says, well, if you were living in the 1950s America, and you went back to 1870s America, it would be an incredibly different world. You would just, everything that you would accept would be completely different. Now, if we were to go from our present time, 2016, back to 1950s America, it would actually be pretty similar. We'd have televisions, radios, fridges, basic appliances, vacuums, all these sorts of things. We'd be missing smartphones and computers, but that's about it. But for all intents and purposes, it hasn't been a big change from the 1950s to today. So Robert Gordon's argument is that today's technologies just aren't that productive. And so this is why we should expect total factor productivity to continue to decline, and then this is going to weigh down on global economic growth. So that's Robert Gordon's argument, and I highly recommend checking out his book as a sort of summary of all of this stuff. But now we've got a similar argument from Tyler Cowen, who's he's broadly a libertarian right sort of economist, but even he recognizes that something's wrong with capitalism. And his argument is that we're in a period of great stagnation, and he says, well, the low-hanging fruit of history have been used up. And this expands Gordon's arguments, I think. So it's not just a matter that we had easy technological developments from 1840 to 1940. It's also a matter of a number of other one-off sort of boosts to the economy. So one of these is free unused land in America. Now, it wasn't unused, it wasn't entirely free, but it was relatively easy for colonizers to come and force the natives off the land. And this allowed America to take advantage of a huge number of immigrants coming in and boosting the American economy as a result. And I see Philip mentions advances in the realm of circulation rather than production, which is absolutely true. So the logistics revolution is a good example, but it doesn't necessarily improve productivity. It improves how we distribute these goods, but not how efficiently we produce them. So a lot of advances have gone there. So back to Tyler Cowen, he says, these low-hanging fruits of history, easy technological developments, free unused land in America. And then he also points out, and I think this is a really important one, there was a large group of citizens that you could educate. So in 1900 in America, 6.4% of US children had graduated high school. By 1960, 60% had graduated high school. Now, the problem here is that there's sort of declining, diminishing returns to trying to educate more and more people. So to take everybody from no high school education to at least high school education, that's a huge bump up in the quality of your labor, your workforce. But then to take that, that high school educated group and give them a BA, there's a diminishing return there. So it takes a lot more effort to get the same outcome that we once got beforehand. So for Tyler Cowen, this is one of the major reasons why we should expect productivity to continue its downward trend. We've had these one-off points that are no longer there. He also sort of points out, well, we've got a lot of money that has to be spent on areas that are highly resistant to productivity improvements. Two areas in particular, healthcare and education. Both of these, it's nearly impossible to measure what productivity would mean. So what is the output of a healthcare sector? What is the output of an education sector? We can sort of make up numbers for them, but even then we know that they're wrong. So it's hard to measure productivity, and it's hard to imagine how do you get a doctor to serve 5 patients rather than 1 patient and improve their productivity that way. These sectors are very resistant to actually improving their productivity in any way. And a lot of money goes to spending on healthcare and education. So this means a lot of money in the American economy is being channeled into unproductive sectors. Now, not a bad thing by any means, but it just means that we should expect productivity to decline as a result. Okay, so that's a second sort of argument for why productivity has been declining. Now, a third one is that investment isn't sufficient. So this is basically the argument that less money is being spent on productivity-enhancing technologies, and less money is being invested into research and development. And in fact, if we look at the stats, we'll look at them in the fourth week. There has been a slowdown in business investment. And it raises the question of why is this the case? Why are businesses no longer investing? And we'll try and answer that in future weeks. There's also an argument that's been made that more and more money has been misallocated towards the financial sector rather than being allocated towards productive investment. Now, I think that's probably right, but it still leaves open the question of why have businesses decided that we're going to invest in finance rather than investing in expanding our business, which is something that doesn't get answered by a lot of these the people who make this argument. There. Now, a fourth argument comes from Paul Mason. And actually, it's not just Paul Mason. It's a broader sort of autonomous argument about the nature of technology and labor struggles. And he points out that, well, technology is often used to control workers. So if workers become too strong, if they start mobilizing for too high of wages, technology can be used to cut down their power. So automation can be used to reduce the workforce. So bring in a bunch of automation and lay off all of the workers who are causing you trouble. We've also got, sort of arguments from people like Harry Braverman that technology separates manual from intellectual labor and allows management to control de-skilled workers. So again, the sort of idea being that, well, if you have a lot of labor struggles, businesses will invest more in technology to overcome those labor struggles. Now the problem is, as we all know, worker strength has been weakened since the 1970s. So unions are in decline, and labor movement overall has just basically been decimated within the advanced capitalist economies. So what does this mean? Well, the incitement to new technologies has been lost. So businesses no longer have to worry about undercutting workers who are too strong, and so therefore they just don't invest in technology. They don't have any reason to. So that's one sort of argument as well, and I think that's gets at an important aspect of it. This sort of Paul Mason argument and the autonomist argument more broadly. A fifth argument, which I've already sort of mentioned, and this is the argument that service-based economies are naturally less productive. So services in general, it's very hard to improve the productivity of them, to increase the output, to make the process more efficient. So a classic sort of example of this is a haircut. It's very hard to think of how do you improve the productivity of a haircut. It took 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever a century ago. It still takes the same amount of time to get a haircut today. You can't improve the productivity of that. Now, the argument being here that as economies move more and more towards services and away from manufacturing, as they become deindustrialized, we should expect economies to get slower and slower productivity growth. And this is most associated with this economist William Baumol as well. And of course, we have seen a shift to service-based economies in all of the advanced capitalist nations over the past 40 years. Now this chart here, a little bit complicated, but you've got labor productivity on the left-hand side, you've got hourly productivity on the right-hand side, and basically what this shows is that if you look at all the different economies, how important the service sector is to their economy, then look at their level of productivity, Regardless of how you measure productivity, service sector-based economies tend to be less productive. So this basically is good evidence for William Baumol's thesis. And it would suggest that as we deindustrialize and continue to deindustrialize, we should expect more and more and more, less and less productivity growth as well. One problem with this argument, though, is that it nicely explains advanced capitalist economies. It doesn't really explain low-income economies. It doesn't explain global trends. And we've seen a diminishment of productivity in those economies as well. So this seems to miss out on part of the answer. Now, another group of people argues, well, it might be a temporary decline. Maybe we're just at a sort of lull, and we should expect technology and productivity to shoot up within the next 5-10 years. And there's something to this. So productivity enhancements, you usually do have delays in them. So one example is the sort of investments in ICT technology or ICT stuff in the 1980s didn't really pay off until the 1990s. So it took about 15-20 years for investment in new technologies to actually show up in the productivity figures. So the argument here being that, well, maybe that's what's happening here. And we've still got a case of all the existing technologies which could spur even more productivity. So without even investing any more, McKinsey estimates that if we were to make an extra push with the technologies that we have, we would get 3% productivity growth. So pretty good stuff. And likewise with new technologies. So if we were to start investing in the new technologies coming on board, McKinsey thinks we could get an additional 1% productivity growth, which would be very, very high level. So maybe it's a temporary thing. Maybe we'll see businesses investing in this stuff, and we'll see, by 2020 or 2025, we'll see productivity come back up again. Now, that's a possibility, but I think it's unlikely, largely because investment is quite low. So it doesn't seem to be happening in the way that would be needed. Okay, the next argument.
Nick, I have a question.
Yeah.
Let me put you on. Okay, so my question is, how does, how do you see? Because okay, let's just go to the argument that the reason why you see these limits is faith-based, because the capitalist class itself has lost its faith in the effectivity of accumulation via investment in production. So it's sort of like also a cultural thing on the side of those who decide where should the investment go, right? And then this is what contributes in a way to sort of like the asset bubbles, because they'd rather park it in physical, actual things that they know will appreciate in price than to put it in a production in which they don't have faith.
Yeah, no, I think so. I don't want to deny the sort of importance of hype and animal spirits and business confidence and all of this sort of stuff, the sort of psychological and cultural mechanisms which lead businesses to think, yeah, now's a good time to invest. That being said, I don't think it's the only story. I think there are, I don't want to say more real factors, but they're more material factors involved, more objective factors rather than subjective. And this has to do with things like the tendency for the rate of profit to decline and stuff like that, which we'll look at again in future weeks. But again, the question is, well, why aren't businesses investing? Why aren't capitalists thinking now is a good time to invest? And that's a big question that we can hopefully debate over the next couple of weeks.
May I suggest that we look at the capacity of industry in the North? If companies are sitting on excess capacity, then there's really very little reason for them to buy more machines to stay idle. If their current existing machines are 30% of their existing machinery in constant capital is idle, so why add to that problem? So I would think that that's a more structural, material reason for why the animal spirits are not bubbling up here more, because they don't have the avenues to do that. Now the question becomes, why don't they have why is there so much excess capacity? And it may have to do with the fact that they want to keep the wages as low as possible, moving to lower and lower wages, wage-based labor in the South and countries in the periphery, and in Asia and India, et cetera, in Africa and South America. And by doing that, lowers, there tends to be more a lack of effective demand. On top of that issue, if you have monopolies, the monopolies aren't going to just lower their prices, because lowering their prices affects they don't have to lower their prices, no competition. And two, it negatively affects their rate of return on capital, so rate of profit. So those seem to me systemic or structural problems in the nature of capitalism itself. And on top of all of that is what you alluded to a couple of times, is related to this question of productivity, and what Robert Gordon was saying is the issue of what are the use values that are being produced. The use values are houses in the first part of the century, houses, cars, and things, refrigerators, electricity, things that actually have some value in a society. But now you go and and I see that you pointed this out in accelerationist manifestos and whatnot, that you're producing these things instead. You're producing iPhones. Well, that doesn't shelter people, it doesn't feed people, but it takes up their time and keeps them quiet, perhaps. But it doesn't really produce the kind of goods that we really need.
Well, Stephen, I mean, the mainstream economists' argument about that is who decides what is a need and what is not. I mean, it's a very interesting question, how you measure need. I mean, their notion is that essentially if someone will pay money for it, it's a sign that they need it. That need is, in other words, needs comes from the consumer rather than it's something generated by advertising and other things. But I mean, I think we all agree with what Nick is saying, that the structural factors are the things that are driving the situation, and a lot of the psychological symptoms are responses to these factors, like the animal spirits. Even something like effective demand. I've heard people who critique the Keynesian thesis say, but effective demand is itself a symptom of something else, the slow fall in the rate of profit. So how do you, what we're trying to do is to correlate the structural factors with some of the manifestations of it at another level. And I do think it's interesting, as Nick points out, how everybody from mainstream economists to right libertarians like Tyler Cowen and so forth are converging on some notion of secular stagnation, while at the same time resisting inquiring deeper as to what might be bringing it about and what would really, if anything, deal with it.
Yeah.
And I would also submit. Oh, sorry, Nick.
No, go ahead.
I'd also submit that the example of smartphones and related technologies is a really excellent, potentially a really excellent example and argument for this being a temporary slowdown, at least in part. Because, I mean, ultimately, smartphones and related infrastructure are only about a decade old. which is pretty extraordinary when you look at the level or the pervasiveness of, addiction, production, use, and so forth. But the software that's actually running on them, the forms of networking occurring, like the degree of adoption of educational software, and all of the real potential added values in areas of productivity like education, coordination, and so forth, are still things that are running much behind the level of hardware adoption. And that's partially because you need like a different kinds of business and social models for taking advantage of this kind of networking in a way that adds to productivity, and that it's a totally different model of education, for example, than industrialized education. And I mean, it seems as if we would be able to presume that that's something that will inevitably catch up short of some sort of giant disaster over the next decade or so.
Yeah, so a couple different aspects in there. The first point about overcapacity, which I think is something that, I mean, Robert Brenner is really good on overcapacity of manufacturing, and I think this is something that tends to be forgotten. But there's a really interesting phenomenon in America, at least, where if you look at the past, I think, 40 years or so, and you look at industrial capacity usage, and you see every single recession, industrial capacity drops down, and then it comes back up, but it never comes back up to the full level it did before. And it's been dipping down again and again and again every single recession. And there's this sort of weird thing where there's a huge amount of overcapacity now in the system. And this does lead to problems of, well, why would you invest if you've already got the capacity, but you can't find a profitable use for it? On the issues of technology and stuff, contemporary technology in particular, so Robert Gordon has an argument. A lot of critics of Robert Gordon are saying, well, you just don't know what's going to happen with technology in the next decade or two. So there's a famous quote from a guy in 1900 where he basically said, all the basic things that we need invented are already invented. And that was clearly wrong, clearly insane. Maybe the same thing will happen with Robert Gordon. We don't know what might come along in 5, 10, 20 years to drastically change the productivity of the economy. Now, that's always a possibility. I know Robert Gordon, in the end of his book, I'm like 400 pages in, so I haven't got to this part yet. In the end of his book, he actually takes on the critics who say, well, what about big data, robotics, self-driving cars, 3D printing? What about all this new technology that we have right now? Isn't this going to increase productivity? So he does try and tackle those sorts of arguments and say, well, not that they won't increase productivity, but they won't increase productivity the way in which these earlier technologies did. And I think that's his really important point, is that we really don't recognize how much of a change the early 1900s were in our economies and in our lives. We feel like things are changing massively today, but actually there's a fundamental similarity even 20, 30 years ago. Beyond the addition of the smartphone, it's not changed that much. So that's one of his points, and I think it's a fairly persuasive argument.
Don't you think we need to look at this by sector to a large extent? For example, you have the sector of software and hardware that you presume you're going to get to this in your fourth class, that is going to potentially replace hordes of workers with robotics and whatnot. And then there's the question of effective demand. I mean, there's a question of, well, who's going to buy the shit that you're making, and what's going to happen with that. And that seems to me that these things are totally integrated, so that the nature of the production that's taking place now has the capability not to house us so much, and not to feed us, and not to help to give us health care and education. It may, to some extent, might give some education, etc. But rather, what's going on is a kind of productivity gains in sectors that are could be used to replace the workforce. And that connected to the idea that they wouldn't have any, who's going to buy this stuff. And the productivity gains, such as they are, even though they're declining, the productivity gains, who benefits from those, just as you showed from that graph, since the 1970s, etc., the owners of capital are benefiting from whatever extent, whatever existing productivity gains are happening. So now you have even a greater income divide and wealth divide in the society, so that the whole thing is moving in a very precarious direction, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we'll look at the inequality figures in a couple weeks, but yeah, that's exactly what's happened. And I mean, Piketty has a quite interesting argument about why that's happened, and I want to cover that. I know it's quite easy as a Marxist to dismiss Piketty as being mainstream or something, but he's, him and his team have been the ones to actually pull together a huge amount of historical data, an unprecedented amount of historical data. And I think if Marxists are going to be good at economics, you need to be following the data. So I think it's worth taking Piketty very seriously on these issues.
Can I just refine a little Stephen's point? And I think it's a good policy to be a little agnostic about the future effect of certain technologies like iPhones, IT, and so forth. One can make one's case better, one, with the ubiquitous rise of branding, which is much more obviously a case of something that just adds symbolic value and is not something that clothes people any better when they're wearing Prada as opposed to when they're wearing something else. And two, the kind of all the money that's spent on lobbying and also particularly the kind of technological innovations of like Jeff Bezos, when he offers a drone service which will deliver something in an hour, which we can be pretty sure was not something clamored for by Amazon customers. I don't want it in a day, I need it in an hour or something like that. Please give us drones, but are more driven by the capitalist imperative to just keep turning out, accumulating, and coming up with new things. So I think we can make our argument sharper if we don't sort of malign technologies which we ourselves are using now and do enable us to do interesting new things, and which people have a kind of a sexy like towards, whether it's the possibility of 3D robots and so forth, while at the same time pointing to the immense amount of waste and non-use value that occurs from capital's need to accumulate.
Yeah, can't add anything to that. I completely agree. Yeah, and I think again, the sort of internet tech-based economy is increasingly oriented around advertising, which is not productive really by anybody's measure. It's hard to say that advertising is like a great use of our resources. I'm almost done with these sort of explanations of productivity decline. I'm going to go finish them, and then we can open it up for some discussion at the end of the class as well.
Nick, I just wanted to add.
Yep.
We have about 30 minutes left of the class. That's all. So because we started at 12:25, so this half an hour could be for a little bit more explanation by you, and then maybe some discussion.
Yeah, so I've got, I think, about 5-10 minutes left of material, and then we'll just open it up. I'll see if I can share this thing again. Okay. So we saw the argument that maybe there's a temporary decline in productivity. This is probably partially right, but it still seems a bit optimistic especially given how shit the global economy is. So what's another explanation? Well, this is measurement. So again, I said measurement, it turns out, is a very big issue in economics. And possibly, productivity is just being mismeasured. So maybe, productivity is measured in terms of output. It's measured in terms of GDP, but GDP only applies to things which you pay money for. A lot of the things that the internet has given us are free. So we've got smartphone apps, most of them are free. Social media, which is free. Most of the internet is free. The capacity to use Skype or Google Hangouts or Google Maps or anything, all of this is provided for free, which you can imagine we would pay for if we were forced to. We would pay for access to a lot of these things because they have some value for us. Now that means because they're free, they're not counted in GDP, and that means they're therefore not counted within productivity stats. So the suggestion here being that maybe we're actually missing a lot of important changes. Now, I think that's partially right. But let me skip ahead here, two things. Mismeasurement cuts both, or sorry, the second part there, mismeasurement has to have grown. This is, I think, the key sort of part. So, yes, we're missing some aspects of the productivity enhancements today. Some things are free, they don't show up in the output. But that was always the case. So to say that it's a problem today, you have to say that it's actually worse than it was beforehand. And this is one of the really fascinating aspects about Robert Gordon's book, is that he shows that the improvements of things like electricity, refrigeration, medicine, indoor plumbing, the improvements that came with this stuff were vastly beyond what their monetary worth was. And so the huge boost in global economic output at that time that didn't go measured by productivity or by GDP. And to say that the smartphone somehow compares to indoor plumbing and refrigeration or medicine, it seems to sort of, it doesn't seem right. And so I think Robert Gordon has a very good argument against this sort of point. Yes, we're missing some of the changes in productivity today, but is it any worse than it was in the 1900s? Probably not. So I don't find this argument very persuasive. Now, there's another sort of technical argument about mismeasurement, and this comes from Susan Haussmann. And this is somewhat technical, but I think it's interesting just to sort of get a sense of how productivity is measured. And she points out, well, there's a mismeasurement of imports. So we know that offshoring, when a company decides to offshore, it involves getting cheaper inputs. You move a factory someplace else because you can get cheaper inputs to your production process. Now the problem is that price deflation isn't taken into account by productivity statistics. So we can imagine here, factory one is a domestic factory, it produces cars, it purchases 4 domestic tires, and it pays £200 for them. Now factory 2 gets its tires from an outsourced producer, and it purchases the same 4 tires for £100. Now for factory 1 versus factory 2, it looks like there's a lot more inputs into factory 1. So this means that even though they produce 1 car as a result of these 4 tires, it looks like factory 1 is far less productive than factory 2. So this is a sort of measurement problem involved in productivity, which basically suggests that when you expand it to the size of an entire economy, all of the offshoring and outsourced stuff hasn't been taken into account by productivity statistics. And it makes inputs look like they're reduced when they're not actually reduced. So this actually means that productivity is higher than it actually is. Now that's sort of technical, but I do think it's sort of interesting because when you start to get down to the nitty-gritty of how productivity and GDP and all of these things are measured, you realize how much of it is just very contestable. There are reasons why they're measured this way, but there are massive problems as a result. Okay. Now, the other sort of aspect about this question about is productivity being mismeasured? So we saw that mismeasurement has to have grown, but mismeasurement also cuts both ways. So yes, the smartphone has given us all this extra stuff for free. It allows us to have access to video chats and free navigation tools, all of this sort of stuff. That's great. It also means there's a lost productivity. So how much time is lost in an office because people are screwing around on social media? How much time is lost at an office because IT is down and you can't gain access to the system? So that sort of stuff doesn't get taken into account either. And so the point sort of being, well, yes, there's mismeasurement which may suggest we have higher productivity. There's also mismeasurement which suggests that we may actually have lower productivity. So all of these sorts of aspects play into the question of whether or not productivity is being mismeasured. No, so those are, I think that's 7 different explanations for why productivity has been decreasing. I'll sort of leave it at that for now, for today. I think we've got about a half an hour left or so, and maybe we can have a discussion about these issues or about broader issues as well, if people want.
Nick, it would be also good if you talk a little bit about your expectations and the requirements for the class, maybe at the end of the discussion or somewhere. Oh, I put you on mute. Sorry.
I'm open to suggestions from people. I believe standard for the New Center stuff is 1 essay at the end. If people want, you could write your own sort of essay question and respond to it, as long as it's related to the topics of the class. Alternatively, I can give people essay questions, and you can respond to them, and I can then mark them and give feedback on all of it, whatever people want. So I'll sort of leave it up to you. Like if you decide, if you have an idea in mind that you want to work on, run the question by me, and then I'll give it an okay. If you want a question from me, just let me know, and I'll send you a list.
So I would try to start the discussion because it seems to be people are like quiet, and maybe we can get something going together. So I've been working on this piece. It's only 100 words so far, but really, and it has something to do with what I wasn't sure Philip or Stefan brought up, right? Which has to do with like real and fictitious labor, or like real and fictitious capital, and also the whole question of labor theory of value. What I'm writing, and it's still in the very like early stages, is that I think it was Stefan who brought it up, that like, you know, nature and labor and technology are, there has to be a way of weaving together some kind of understanding of value as being contributed to in this like complex interaction between nature, labor, and technology. And when I talk about technology, I'm talking about a larger sense of what technology is, which then technologies of power are technologies. So then power itself becomes sort of like part of the deal rather than power. The way Nitton and Bichler look at it is the end all be all, and everything is subsumed into the power theory of value, right? So a way of also understanding how these three interact with each other, and how and then maybe that will have an impact on the way we look at what is productive investment, because productive in particular technologies that have a productive end could then be still considered productive investment, rather than, even though it appears in early stages. I mean, we're really early in what so far has been characterized in the classroom as sort of like internet industry, or like high-tech internet-related industry. Like, these phones still don't do more than 10% of what a tool like that in everyone's pocket can do, right? So if we speculate on the kind of stuff that millions and millions of people will be able to do, there would be a way to maybe sort of like see it as a temporary sort of like stagnation, but also reconfigure how these things relate to each other.
I would. Can you hear? The labor theory. Oh, I'm echoing for some. Okay, I'll try again. Yeah. The labor theory of value is such a complex notion that's easily simplified, caricatured, and so forth, and that of which the level of informed disagreement on a site like the new Marx lecture of value form theory is just so technical that it might be useful for a while to work with a simple distinction between wealth and value, with the idea being that capitalism presents itself as a creator of wealth, but it's all about creating value through accumulation. We think of wealth in terms of abundance. Adam Smith even thought of it that, because he called his book The Wealth of Nations. And almost every kind of dream of capital suddenly working out in the future projects 50 years down the road, whether it's Keynes economics for our grandchildren or something, an age of abundance when all of the kind of distortions and irrationalities will be worked out, and everything will be fine-tuned so that capital is a wealth-producing machine, which will turn out in abundance the goods everybody needs. We know that doesn't happen, but we know those futures keep being projected out of capital. It'll happen if you just let the market rip or do whatever, and in 50 years it'll come down the road. So projecting that phantasmagoria of wealth and satisfied needs, and forgetting or repressing the notion that it is all about the creation of value is one of the things we have to deal with. So rather than getting technical and trying to decide, advocate the labor theory of value, which would almost lead us into a different kind of course, we can take the sort of claim to be producing wealth by capital at face value and simply show that this is not happening, and that certain amounts of stagnation and crisis are built in the whole process of accumulation as it goes on and on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'm trying to do with this module is to sort of get to Marxist conclusions without any Marxist assumptions. So using mainstream economics data and mainstream economics theories, showing that even on their own basis, they lead us to questions about profitability and why profitability might have been declining in recent decades. I think in terms of wealth versus value, yeah, you're absolutely right. And the great promise of capitalism has been that it's the best wealth-generating system we've ever imagined. And the sort of promise of communism was that, well, actually we can do better. We can rationalize it, and basically, capitalism does produce wealth, but it produces it as a derivative side effect of producing value. Um, Producing wealth is not its primary goal, and this leads us to, not investing in vaccinations for Ebola and things like that, which under communism would just be quite obvious. So I think that sort of loose distinction between wealth and value is absolutely right. We don't have to hold to a strict sort of Marxist definition of it, at least for me personally as well. I don't know where I stand on the issues of value theory. I think too often people sort of start with basic metaphysical presuppositions and then fit the world into their frameworks. Whereas I think it's more interesting to sort of look at the world and see, well, what is actually going on, and then sort of trying to determine something on the basis of that. So I'm trying to do all of this work without assuming the labor theory of value or a marginalist theory of value or a power theory of value. I think eventually you lead into these questions, but I think it's pretty surprising how far you can get without having to step onto the territory of metaphysics. So I think that's sort of one of the experiments I'm trying to do in this course. I will say, for Nitzan and Bishop, I mean, Mo and I have had this argument a number of times. I don't find them particularly persuasive. I still don't know what they mean by power. It seems wildly underdeveloped despite being their theory.
I'm coming around.
Yeah.
Whose theory is this?
What was that, sorry?
Whose theory is the power?
I will post some text.
Nitzan and Bischler's theory.
Alright, yeah, show it to me. But I'll see. One thing that I wanted to say is that, well, first off, let's suppose that, hypothetically in the future, we'll somehow get more growth, new productivity, boom, blah, 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 blah. Well, then we'll just be in the same position afterwards. It's like that's the big thing where people were hating on where I think we got out of the whole sort of postmodern embrace of capitalism, because we're well, yeah, there's revolutionary difference, but Marx was overturning of all values, blah 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 blah. That's old news. The new news that we hear every day is in fact old news. So, and then another thing that I wanted to say is that question of wealth and productivity and how we appreciate productivity is that within the capitalist ethics is that a lot of actually productive stuff, more specifically, I think the total factors of production thing, that little 1% that will save the world from catastrophic disaster, I don't think capitalism does a very good job at appreciating according to that standard whatsoever. Because if you think the majority of research and development, well, first of all, I want to say that the specificity of the appraisal of investment. If you think me and Philip were having a little thing in chat, we were talking about how investors favor high liquidity markets or with high investment. And what I said is that it's ends up there is no net, or if there is very little net increase in total production, even though all that money exchanged hands. What you end up with is whoever is holding the bubble when it bursts ends up out so much dough, and other people have it. It was just a transfer of the organization of funds. And then Ebola research, a lot of stuff that does increase productive capacity. I even think research whose intention is to directly increase productive capacity and whatnot. I don't think that I sort of have a belief in the labor theory of value. Those are other reasons though. But I think that like from the labor theory of value and from even not even the labor theory of value, that research in those areas aren't strictly profitable. Because think about it, like you aren't selling a product with innovation. You could sell the patent for the innovation. You could implement the innovation and use that in a productive apparatus. But paying these people to do research to invent that innovation directly is not profitable. Now companies do this because they know like, oh, research and development will end up, increasing expansion, innovation, blah 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 in the long run. So the capitalism does do that, but like I definitely don't think it's the best way to appraise research and development. To finish that off, like I think that like on one hand we should like I think a big I'm not sure. I think it might have to do with control of the banks, what the banks do. Like I definitely think we shouldn't be completely nihilistic. We should bank on the capacity for, like on one hand we need to, in the short run we definitely need to focus on like redistribution of wealth, redistribution of resources towards what according to capitalist frameworks of priorities is not productive, but what we know is productive research, and maneuvering resources in that direction. And also, in the long run, I think establishing exterior to capital mechanisms of production and allocation that appreciate, I mean, at this point, like I don't know if you'd call it investment, but sure, okay, I definitely agree with you. Like we as constructing it's a big thing. I guess it's sort of indeterminate we at this point. But I would say workers of the world or whatever. I don't know. I'm just facetious there. But no, that with that like the problem is we need to develop mechanisms that are simultaneously institutionalized and also cultural to appreciate work differently, I think. You might have some points with that. But like, I think you see where I'm getting at. Like, we need to like. Okay, I'm saying we again. I know, bad. But it's a matter of appreciating productivity differently, I think.
Thank you.
I might pick up on your one point. I think the sort of what you started with there about what if capitalism does solve all these problems and manages to get some decent growth going again? What we're left with is just still capitalism, which seems to have reached its peak in late 1950s, early 1960s, and has been basically downhill ever since. And that involved massive colonialism. It involved massive gender hierarchies in the workplace. Involved massive racial hierarchies in the workplace. And that was as good as capitalism could ever get. Yeah, I think we need to, even if all these problems are solved, we still need to be thinking about an alternative system. I sort of think one of the interesting aspects is there is a tendency for oh, and sorry, I just got word actually from a friend.
No, I know. I was going to say that Corbyn is on the ballot. So
Corbyn's on the ballot. Which is good.
I was going to announce that before you, and then I didn't want to interrupt. But yeah, congratulations.
So that's good news. But yeah, so okay, capitalism solves all these problems, and we're still left with capitalism. But I think that what's interesting about looking at these sort of challenges facing capitalism right now is it helps the left, whoever defines himself as being part of that we, it helps them understand what is the long-term sort of tendencies within capitalism, where is the crisis likely to happen, how do we build a response to that sort of crisis, how do we build alternative means of reproduction in expectation of that sort of crisis, what is capitalism likely to do in response to those crisis features. That sort of stuff I think is really important if we want to make any sort of left strategy for what we want to do for politics. We need to understand where the global economy is headed, and that means not just going back to Capital Volume 1, 2, 3, 4. It means paying attention to the data today, figuring out exactly what is going on today, because Marx didn't have shadow banking, he didn't have high-frequency trading, he didn't have special economic zones, so how has the world changed now, and we need to be paying attention to that. So that's what I'm trying to do, I think.
I
think
Nick, I want to make a short video of this last thing you said and kind of like add it to my Instagram or something. Like the part you said, like we should refrain from going to Capital 1, 2, and 3 and instead look at the data and shadow banking. Just that, if you allow. It's a really.
I say that though, but like Capital Volume 1 is fantastic, and I think everybody should read it still.
Nobody says that it's not fantastic, but you're right. There was no shadow banking, and there wasn't like Bitcoin and blockchain or any of this other later even stuff around. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I mean.
Well, I agree too. I mean, I would like to frame it a little differently, though. I mean, in other words, I think the notion of looking at how mainstream economics is approaching a picture that in some degree coincides with what's coming from Marx and the left. I also appreciate, for example, what Anwar Sheikh is doing now, and where the notion is that the New School has started a department of capitalism studies, where they're literally trying to look at capitalism empirically, come up with a theory that doesn't begin by assuming equilibrium, perfect competition, and all those kind of fantasies that they construct. But I would like to suggest that Marx is, one, a lot more ambiguous and interesting on the notion of crises than it seems in the Communist Manifesto, where everybody thought there would be a final crisis of capitalism, boom, the workers would all be brought together in factories and organized, and that didn't happen, so Marx's history has passed marked by. You know, there's a second theory of crisis in Marx at various points, which talks about the notion of crisis as a way of creative destruction, of rebooting capitalism, of wiping out all the ineffective capitalism going on. So technically, in that sort of vision or nightmare or zombie horror movie, you know, the dead capitalist monster vampire werewolf gets up again somehow and keeps going by maybe performing what Harvey calls a spatial fix or whatever. There seems to be a return now with the notion of the long downturn and so forth, and the notion that this might be not so much a final crisis, but maybe a stagnation point that people can't, that capital can't recover from. But of course, we have to be very wary of all those conclusions, because one can find within Marx even a theoretical framework for almost either notion of crisis. And I think it's also very important to think that it's not a question that there are new things like shadow banking and high-frequency trading, which Marx couldn't model in his version of Capital. Marx's version of Capital wasn't a historical version. He came up with a kind of I won't call it a Weberian ideal type of a mode of production, but something that's equivalent to Newton's notion of gravity without friction, where he's looking for laws of motion and accumulation. So even Harvey has pointed out that in some ways capitalism has kind of evolved towards a form that is even more Marxian and naked than it was in the 19th century. He's not giving us a picture of Victorian England. He's sketching a picture of a mode of production which interacts or determines or is part of a hybridized social formation in which it has, in each case, whether or not we have free labor power that it's sold or indentured labor, which is going on in the accumulation, it seems that with whatever hybrid form, capital still keeps accumulating. So, while totally in accord with Nick's idea of just looking at it empirically and just, throwing this against Marx, I'm against the notion of not continually going back and not just reading Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3, but looking at what I call the Marx research process, and as it evolves better approximations of what this strange new thing that came into the world called capitalism that emerged from the confluence of a number of streams and that we're trying to get out of involves.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I mean, I do think Anwar Sheikh's book and the work that he's been doing, I think, is some of the best stuff that's been going on in sort of leftist economics for a long time. Precisely because he is attuned to the empirical stuff, but he's also got that theoretical framework, which is highly Marxist, and yeah, it's just a really nice mixture of everything. I mean, I set empirical stuff against Marxism, but it's mostly against Marxists who just sort of dogmatically hew to the volumes of capital. That's what I find quite problematic. I think what's interesting is that actually, if you do go back to Marx, you see that there is a lot of stuff which is very suggestive for what's going on today. So stuff like the gig economy, Uber and Handy and all of these sorts of like online labor market platforms, all of this stuff was actually already sort of prescribed by Marx. He says at one point in Capital Volume 1, he says, piecework is the ultimate form of wages for capitalism. And this is exactly what Amazon Mechanical Turk and Handy and Uber are. They're piecework, just online. And it's no surprise to see that capitalism sort of tendentially tries to make labor markets like that. So it's there in Marx. Uber is in Marx, surprisingly enough. But you just sort of have to be aware of how these sort of theoretical principles and the tendencies he outlines take shape under different conditions today. And this is what I think Sheikh does very, very well. I see Philip mention, we need to do a political economy and the critique of political economy. This is what I think Sheikh does. He does the critique of political economy today by completely getting rid of perfect competition in ideal markets, but also the sort of heterodox perspective which says we have imperfect competition in imperfect markets, but still takes the perfect model as its ideal situation. And Sheikh's book, I can't recommend it enough. I think if you want to do leftist economics today, that's the place to go, to start with at least. I don't know if we're out of time now or not.
We absolutely have gone a few minutes, only 3 minutes over time. But you need a drink. I certainly do, and it's really a moment to celebrate. I have a little bit left. That Corbyn's on the ballot, and this is like sort of like I mean, it's a defeat, right? Like the coup is defeated. It's over because they know that if he's on a ballot, more likely he will win. So
yeah, so he's going to win without a doubt. What's likely to happen now is pressure towards a split party.
Yeah, which is could be a blessing in disguise.
I think a split was almost inevitable, even if Corbyn wasn't put on. The real question would be to keep the Labour Party moniker. So now it'll be Corbyn rather than having to split off and start a new party with him. So it's a big win. It's a really big win.
So there was a question about whether he would be on the ballot?
Labour Party rules, so when there's a leadership challenge, he has to be, well, the argument was that he had to be nominated by 40 MPs, and it wasn't clear that he would get 40 MPs to be nominated. But the rules actually changed in 2008, I think, where it says that the present leader doesn't need to be renominated. He's automatically, or she's automatically renominated. And the entire debate was about how do you interpret this particular rule, which is really clear to everybody who read it, but like this is politics, so yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for this lively and wonderful sort of historical session with all the stuff that was going on both in the U.S. with Sanders endorsing Clinton and then Corbyn getting on a ballot. I will post the conversation on a sidebar in the classroom. Tony's just setting it up. And all the readings and stuff that I brought up or I received from Nick, I will add there, and then we can continue on the discussion there in the class, in the Google Classroom. Or next session of the class, we will all be here, hopefully with more people.
Sounds good.
Stop the broadcast.